you are not. Your world shrinks to the size of a shameful secret you carry in your blood. Your skin erupts in a constellation of sores and pustules, turning into a bloody, oozing map of your shame. Your nose collapses into your face, leaving a gaping black hole where features once were. The rot reaches your brain, and you descend into madness, your mind dissolving in the acid of paranoia and delirium. For centuries, it was called the Great Pox, a disease so shameful that it was named after enemies. The curse passed around like a hot coal. A plague so mysterious that we still argue about where it came from. The most popular theory blames the sailors of Christopher Columbus. They landed on the island of Hispaniola in 1493 in search of gold, driven by greed and glory. But they found something else, something that awaited them in the shadows of the rainforests, in the blood of the people they came to conquer. When they returned to Barcelona, the city welcomed them as heroes. But soon, doctors began to write about a strange, unknown disease consuming the crew from within. The sailors' skin became covered in terrible sores that would not heal. Their joints ached, and at night they were shaken by fevers that brought nightmarish visions. They called it the Indian disease. But they were just the first sparks. The real fire that would engulf all of Europe was yet to come. The fuse was truly lit only 2 years later, during a war. The French king, Charles VIII, young, ambitious, and reckless, gathered an army of almost 40,000 men to claim the Kingdom of Naples. It was not just an army, it was a melting pot of nations. Swiss pikemen, German lanzknechts, Gascon crossbowmen, and French knights, all united by a thirst for profit. The city of Naples, the jewel of southern Italy, fell almost without a fight. Its defenders scattered, and the nobility hurried to swear allegiance to their new master. And to celebrate the victory, the king held a feast that lasted for 2 months. It was an orgy of triumph, a festival of flesh and wine that knew no bounds. Every week, a new feast, a new favorite courtesan. Wine flowed like a river, and the beautiful Neapolitan women whose husbands and brothers had fled or been killed served the army of conquerors. They danced in the palace parks to the sound of the lute, then disappeared into shady groves with soldiers whose pockets were filled with plundered silver. But they did not know they were already doomed. It was a perfect storm, a vast, crowded army of men, torn from home and family, intoxicated by easy victory and complete impunity. An endless stream of prostitutes, flocking to the victors' camp from all over Italy, drawn by the scent of money and power. They brought with them not only solace, but also death. And a new, invisible killer, hiding in their blood, transmitted in hot embraces, in kisses, in every act of intimacy that should have been a celebration of life, but became a harbinger of death. The nightmare was just beginning. Soon, alarming reports reached King Charles VIII, feasting in the captured palace. His men were sick, not just the common soldiers from the barracks, but also noble lords and knights who attended his lavish banquets. The epidemic swept through the ranks with the speed of a wildfire, and his army was rapidly losing its combat effectiveness. Some doctors, in complete desperation and ignorance, insisted that one specific woman was to blame, a beautiful courtesan who had supposedly been infected by someone who ate human flesh in distant lands. Others blamed the bad air of Naples, the cursed water, or even the unfavorable alignment of the stars. No one understood that the enemy was already inside. The king, seized by panic, decided to flee. He would take his army and return to France, far from this Neapolitan plague. But it was too late. As his decomposing army retreated, the disease began its own campaign of conquest across Europe. And it spared no one. Peasants, nobles, and even priests began to show the terrifying signs of the illness. The Pope himself, Alexander VI, whose name was already synonymous with debauchery, fell ill. To save the Church's authority, the cardinals spread rumors that the disease could be transmitted through the air, or even by touching holy water. Priests from their pulpits began to preach chastity and asceticism, but their words were drowned out by the groans of the sick. The plague was already within the walls of the Vatican. When King Charles finally reached France, Paris was already gripped by the epidemic. The most famous and wealthy courtesans of the city, whose salons were once frequented by princes and poets seeking salvation in desperation, fled to convents for repentant sinners, hoping to beg God for forgiveness. Their beauty, their greatest asset, was turning into a hideous mask of death. The conquering army, composed mainly of mercenaries from all over Europe, was disbanded. These men, now carriers of an invisible poison, dispersed to their homes, to Germany, Switzerland, Spain, and England. Each of them carried the seed of the pandemic in his blood. The epidemic turned into a firestorm that engulfed the entire continent. The first outbreak was incredibly deadly. In this lies the grim, ruthless logic of first contact. A new infectious agent does not seek to kill its host. It wants to coexist, multiply, and spread. But it takes time to find this fragile balance, for the host's body to adapt and the microbe to soften its attack. The first encounter is always the most brutal, the bloodiest slaughter. Along with the disease came blame. Everyone tried to distance themselves from the shameful ailment, shifting the blame onto their neighbors, their enemies. In Russia, Britain, and Germany, it was the French disease, a legacy of Charles's army. The Poles, who fought against the Germans, called it the German disease. The Portuguese, the Spanish disease. The Turks, observing the agony of the Christian world, simply and contemptuously called it the Christian disease. But behind all these names hid the same primal terror. The disease would receive its final scientific name only in 1530. A doctor and poet from Verona, Girolamo Fracastoro, wrote a long didactic poem in Latin about the new ailment, seeking to enlighten his colleagues and the public. In his allegorical story, a shepherd named Syphilis angered the god Apollo by refusing to make sacrifices to him. As punishment, the gods cursed him and his people with a new, horrifying malady. The name stuck, becoming an eternal stigma of shame and suffering. The clinical picture of syphilis is a slowly unfolding horror movie in 3 acts. After an incubation period of 2 to 3 weeks, a small, hard sore appears at the site of the initial infection, on the genitals, lips, or in the mouth. This is a hard chancre. It looks sinister, but most insidiously, it is completely painless. After a few weeks, it disappears on its own, creating the cruel illusion of a full recovery. But this is merely the calm before the storm. The real disease is just beginning. A month or 2 later, the second, explosive stage begins. The patient loses their appetite and is tormented by weakness, as if all their life force has been drained from them. A fever begins, accompanied by agonizing headaches and aches all over the body. Lymph nodes throughout the body swell, turning into painful lumps under the skin. Then a rash appears, ugly red and copper spots, pustules, that cover the entire body, even the palms and soles, places that usually remain clear. At this stage, the disease is extremely contagious. Every kiss, every touch can transmit the curse. The patient becomes a walking biological weapon. Then, after several years of deceptive calm, the third, final stage can begin. It is a slow, methodical self-destruction. The body begins to devour itself from the inside out. Necrosis begins, the rotting of infected tissues and organs. Gummas, soft, tumor-like growths, form on the skin and bones, which disintegrate, leaving deep, non-healing ulcers. Openings, fistulas, appear on the body, from which foul-smelling pus constantly oozes. The cartilage in the nose is often the first to be destroyed, causing the face to collapse inward, forming an ugly saddle nose deformity, an unmistakable sign of the disease. But the most terrifying thing happens when the necrosis reaches the spinal cord or the brain. Neurosyphilis begins. The consequences of this stage are a lottery of unimaginable horrors. The patient can go blind as the disease burns away the optic nerves. They can go deaf. They can be struck by paralysis, turning them into a helpless doll. And finally, dementia sets in, the general paralysis of the insane, as the person's very personality is erased. The mind disintegrates into fragments of paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and uncontrollable rage. Most patients who reached this stage died in prolonged agony, trapped in their decaying bodies and fading consciousness, reduced to a shadow of their former selves. The disease hit European brothels the hardest, which turned into incubators of death, but they continued to operate because the demand did not disappear. In late 1509, one of their clients was the famous Florentine writer and politician Niccolò Machiavelli. Later, in a letter to a friend, he described the woman who serviced him with terrifying frankness. "My God, she was so ugly, I nearly fainted. A tuft of hair on her head, but the crown was bald and shiny, which allowed one to see a few lice strolling about. One eye looked up, the other down. Her nose was crooked, and her mouth looked as if it had been smashed with a hammer." This encounter left a permanent scar on him, becoming a grim symbol of the era. The authority of the Catholic Church, already shaken by the corruption and luxury of the papal court, was utterly destroyed. The wrath of God befell not only common sinners but also the priests, cardinals, and bishops themselves, who secretly indulged in carnal pleasures. On this wave of widespread disillusionment and fear, the ideas of a simple German monk named Martin Luther found fertile ground. On October 31st, 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, speaking out against the rich, debauched, and corrupt church. Thus, on the ashes of the old world, burned by the fire of syphilis, Protestantism was born. A new cult of family, fidelity, and puritanical morality emerged. Mores changed radically. Sexuality, previously a subject of celebration, became a source of fear and shame. Fashion followed these changes, becoming darker, more modest, and ascetic. Elaborate wigs, high stiff collars, and long gloves became not just a style, but a necessity. A way to hide sores on the neck, rashes on the hands, and hair loss, the shameful signs of the disease that could lead to social ostracism. All sexual relations not aimed at procreation within marriage were now considered a mortal sin. It was at this time, in a desperate attempt to protect against the invisible enemy, that the first condoms appeared in Europe. The first reliable mention of them dates to 1564, in a treatise by the famous Italian anatomist Gabriele Falloppio. To protect against the French disease, he proposed using a linen sheath soaked in a special chemical solution of salts and herbs, which was to be placed over the organ and secured with a ribbon. An alternative, though less substantiated, theory holds that the first condom, made from a treated sheep's intestine, was created by the personal physician of the notorious English King Henry VIII, a certain Dr. Condom, who was trying to protect the monarch and his numerous mistresses. But what if Columbus and his sailors were innocent? What if the killer had long been roaming the streets of Europe, hiding under a different, less terrifying guise? In recent decades, archaeologists have begun to find evidence that calls the entire classic Columbian theory into question. In the cemetery of an Augustinian friary in the port city of Kingston upon Hull, England, skeletons were found with clear, unmistakable signs of tertiary syphilis, characteristic damage to the skull and long bones. Radiocarbon dating showed that these individuals died between 1300 and 1450, long before Columbus even set out on his first voyage. This gave rise to the pre-Columbian theory. Perhaps an endemic form of syphilis already existed in Europe, but it was much less aggressive, presenting in a milder form. When Columbus's sailors brought a related but weaker microorganism from the New World, the two strains could have hybridized, creating a monstrously virulent mutant that caused that very Great Pox. Another theory, the Unitarian one, suggests that syphilis, yaws, and Betrayal, tropical diseases that cause similar skin and bone lesions, are in fact just different manifestations of the same microorganism, Treponema pallidum, which adapted differently to various climatic conditions and social norms. The mystery of its origin turned out to be almost as complex and convoluted as the disease itself. But for the millions suffering in those dark ages, the origin of the disease was of absolutely no importance. The only thing that mattered was the search for a cure, for any hope of salvation. And the medicine of that time offered its most terrible and cruel answer: mercury. Doctors, based on ancient alchemical doctrine, believed that syphilis should be treated with mercury ointments and by ingesting the toxic metal. This was based on a secret mystical logic that Mercury was the sign of the planet Mercury, which, in turn, was the patron of the market and trade, and syphilis was a disease one caught at the market, from prostitutes. To prepare these hellish ointments, doctors and apothecaries mixed liquid mercury with vinegar, butter, pork lard, turpentine, sulfur, chicken blood, live frogs, snake venom, and sometimes, according to some recipes, even with human flesh taken from executed criminals. The resulting suspension was rubbed directly into open, oozing sores. Patients screamed from unbearable pain, but doctors insisted that this was a sure sign the treatment was working, that the poison was driving out the disease. But the most terrifying and sophisticated method was fumigation, or smoking. The patient's body, with the exception of the head, which stuck out through an opening, was placed in a large wooden barrel or a special box. Then a brazier with cinnabar, mercury sulfide, was placed under the barrel. Hot steam was fed into the barrel, literally baking the patient in poisonous fumes. The goal was to induce profuse, uncontrolled salivation, ptyalism. It was believed that the disease itself left the body along with the saliva. Patients drooled excessively, losing several liters a day, which led to terrible dehydration. Their gums became inflamed, turned black, and rotted. Their teeth began to loosen and fall out in entire rows. Mercury, absorbed through the skin and lungs, destroyed the nervous system, causing uncontrollable tremors, paralysis, and madness. In essence, the symptoms of mercury poisoning were as terrible as the symptoms of syphilis itself. Many died not from the disease, but from this barbaric treatment. The cruel saying of the time, "One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," became a literal reality for thousands of unfortunates. But there were alternatives to Mercury, no less strange and ultimately useless. So-called sweat baths with the addition of lead, which is also a toxic heavy metal, were practiced. Patients were also advised to drink a decoction of ants, cover their sores with plasters of crushed earthworms, and even tie the dissected carcasses of dead chickens to their genitals in the hope that they would draw out the disease. The rich could afford another miracle cure brought from the New World, guaiacum wood, or holy wood, lignum vitae. It cost a fortune, more expensive than gold by weight. Patients had to sit for a month in a hot, hermetically sealed room, sweating profusely and drinking a hot decoction of this wood. It was expensive, grueling, and completely useless against the spirit. But it offered hope, and hope was the most sought-after and expensive commodity in an age of despair. Later, in the early 20th century, another type of treatment was developed, desperate and brilliant in its cruelty: malaria therapy, invented by the Austrian physician Julius Wagner Jauregg. The procedure was called pyrotherapy, and the logic was simple, albeit risky. Treponema pallidum, the causative agent of syphilis, is extremely sensitive to high temperatures and dies at temperatures above 40 Fahrenheit. A patient with neurosyphilis was deliberately injected with malaria-infected blood. Several severe bouts of malarial fever, with a body temperature soaring to 40 degrees and above, could completely rid the body of the syphilitic pathogen. Then, if the patient survived, the malaria was treated with quinine. This did not always work either, and the mortality rate from the treatment itself was high. But patients with neurosyphilis, who faced certain death in madness, readily agreed to any, even the most risky methods. Better to die from malaria than from syphilis. At least their relatives and friends would not be so ashamed. The desperate resorted to the help of surgeons who tried to correct what the disease had done. As early as the 16th century, the Italian surgeon Gaspare Tagliacozzi developed a complex procedure for transplanting skin from the patient's arm to their nose to hide the ugly saddle nose deformity. It was an agonizing, multi-stage process. A skin flap was cut on the upper arm, but not completely detached, and was sewn to the prepared side on the face. The patient had to remain for weeks in a difficult, uncomfortable position, with their arm firmly tied to their head until blood vessels grew into the new site. It was an era of despair, where disfigurement was more feared than death, and treatment was a form of sophisticated torture. The true culprit of all this horror remained invisible, a ghost in the blood. Until the early 20th century. As with most infectious diseases, the true culprit of syphilis was only identified in the early 20th century, when optics and microbiology reached the necessary level. And it happened almost by accident, thanks to bureaucratic persistence and scientific rivalry. Meet Fritz Schaudinn, a famous but hot-tempered German protozoologist. He studied protists, single-celled organisms that are neither animals nor fungi nor plants. For years, he had dedicated his life to this young and little-studied science. In February 1905, when he thought he was on the verge of a great discovery in his field, an official from the Imperial Health Office entered his laboratory without knocking. The official informed him that another scientist, a certain John Siegel, claimed to have found the causative agent of 4 diseases at once, including scarlet fever, smallpox, and, most importantly, syphilis. "That's impossible," Schouten exploded. "I will not waste my precious time on such fabrications and refuting quackery. This is intellectual castration and unparalleled bureaucratic stupidity." But the official was unperturbed. He calmly listened to the scientist's angry tirade, and then just as calmly and politely explained who exactly was funding Schauden's research and how quickly that state funding could be terminated. Schouten, reluctantly, was forced to agree to this, as it seemed to him humiliating work. It was 1905. The causative agents of plague, tuberculosis, and malaria were already known. Syphilis remained the last great medical mystery of the era, and now some unknown upstart, Siegel, claimed to have solved it, supporting his evidence with absurd drawings of a microbe that didn't even look like a microbe. Schouten was supposed to expose him. To refute Siegel's so-called discovery, Schouten went to the Charité clinic in Berlin. A local dermatologist, Erich Hoffmann, provided him with samples of pure, unstained exudate from syphilitic ulcers for his research. After several hours of intense work, peering into the microscope's eyepiece, Schouten noticed something completely different among the clumps of dead tissue and already known microbes. These were barely perceptible, almost transparent bacteria, twisted into a thin spiral that moved with a characteristic rotational motion. They were so pale and thin that they would instantly disappear from view with the slightest change in focal length. Most importantly, these creatures looked nothing like what the charlatan Siegel had drawn in his works. Schouten was pleased. Siegel was defeated. The job was done. He could go back to his beloved protists. But, being a meticulous and pedantic man, he decided to stay at the clinic for a few more days to conduct as many experiments as possible and gather irrefutable evidence. And every time, in every sample taken from people with an active form of syphilis, he found those same strange, ghostly bacteria. He named them Spirochaeta pallida, pale spirochetes. It soon became apparent that there was some fundamental connection between them and the disease itself. They were the ghosts, always present at the scene of the crime. To reach a final conclusion and prove the causal link, Schouten proposed investigating a case of syphilis in its earliest stage by examining a fresh primary chancre. If the pale spirochetes were found this time as well, it would mean they were the cause of it all. Hoffmann immediately began to rummage through his archives and patient records. It turned out that 3 years prior, he had a patient in that exact stage. At the time, he had found nothing unusual in the pus smears, but now they knew exactly what to look for and how. A minute later, Schouten carefully placed the slide under the microscope. The answer to one of the greatest mysteries in medical history had been found. The pale ghost that had destroyed millions had finally been discovered. All that remained was to figure out how to destroy it. Shortly after this, on March 3, 1905, Schouten and Hoffmann presented a report to the Berlin Medical Society. They announced that in all cases of active syphilis they had studied, without exception, they had found pale, spiral-shaped, motile microbes. It also turned out that seeing them under a microscope was very simple, if one knew how. One only had to use the dark field method, positioning the light source not from below, as was usually done, but from the side. Against the dark background, the ghostly bacteria stood out clearly as bright, shimmering silhouettes. However, the pale spirochete, later renamed Treponema pallidum, was a true master of disguise. When the disease entered a hidden, latent stage, the number of pathogens in the blood and tissues sharply decreased, and detecting them with a microscope became practically impossible. Later, complex serological tests were developed for their detection, but there was still no effective cure. Even after the world learned of Fritz Schauden's pale monster, syphilis continued to be treated according to the grim, barbaric precepts of the past, with mercury and bismuth. On an early winter morning in 1906, an event occurred that would forever change the course of medical history. A woman named Franziska Speyer came to the famous German immunologist Paul Ehrlich, already a Nobel laureate. She was the wealthy widow of a well-known Frankfurt philanthropist and had come with a business proposal. She had just donated a huge sum, 1 million marks, for the creation of a new private research institute, and wanted Ehrlich himself to lead it and be given complete freedom of action. It was an offer he could not refuse. Within a few years, the entire world would know the name of Ehrlich and his institute. He, along with the Russian biologist Ilya Mechnikov, had already received the Nobel Prize for his work in immunology. It was this work that clarified a fundamental principle. The interactions between cells, antibodies, and antigens are, in essence, chemical reactions. This, in turn, confirmed Ehrlich's own long-held concept of the magic bullet. All that remained was to find this magical chemical compound. The idea of the magic bullet was simple and elegant. Just as a bullet fired from a gun hits a specific target, a medicine should purposefully attack and destroy specific microbes without harming the body's own cells. As their main target, Ehrlich and his team chose trypanosomes, protozoan parasites, the causative agents of the deadly African sleeping sickness. Day after day, month after month, he and his subordinates, including the Japanese bacteriologist Sahachiro Hata, first infected hundreds of mice and guinea pigs, and then methodically tested new arsenic-based chemical compounds on them, one after another. They worked practically blind by trial and error. It was a monumental, grueling effort. Then, one day, during a routine round of the laboratory, among the many cages of dead animals, they discovered a single survivor. Tests immediately showed that the substance administered to it, compound number 606, had completely cleared the animal's body of the deadly trypanosomes. At that moment, it was as if an idea struck Ehrlich. He rushed to his cabinet to find a 2-year-old medical journal. It contained the very paper by Fritz Schauden on Treponema pallidum. And there it was. The article stated that this microbe was morphologically very similar to the trypanosome. If compound 606 could kill the trypanosome, perhaps it could also kill the cause of syphilis. After a series of additional tests on rabbits infected with syphilis, the effectiveness of compound 606 against Treponema pallidum was confirmed. In 1910, it went on sale under the trade name Salvarsan, which meant saving arsenic. Of course, the drug was not completely safe. It contained poisonous arsenic, and the slightest error in dosage or preparation could be fatal. Salvarsan was distributed in sealed glass ampoules as a yellowish powder that had to be mixed with distilled water and injected intravenously as quickly as possible, before the mixture could oxidize in the air and become even more toxic. In the first year, more than 60,000 patients worldwide received the treatment. There were many cases of miraculous, almost instantaneous cures, but there were also tragic failures. Some patients experienced severe vomiting and dizziness after the injection. Others experienced paralysis of the legs, seizures, and sometimes after the use of Salvarsan, sudden death occurred. It would later be discovered that in most cases, the side effects were caused by incorrect administration of the drug or the unsealing of ampoules during transport, which led to the oxidation of the arsenic. But at that moment, all the blame fell on Ehrlich. Newspapers were filled with headlines about the murderer doctor, The scientist was deeply distressed by this public persecution, but continued to work, obsessed with his idea. In 1912, he created a more advanced and stable drug, compound 9-1-4, or neosalvarsan, which proved to be not as dangerous. Paul Ehrlich refined the method, argued with critics, and proved his case, but in the end, his heart could not withstand the colossal strain. On August 20th, 1915, at the age of 61, Paul Ehrlich died of a stroke. His contemporaries believed the cause was stress and years of overwork. However, the magic bullet he created continued to kill Treponema pallidum around the world until the middle of the century. Many still call salvarsan the world's first antibiotic, although technically it was not. But Paul Ehrlich still proudly and quite deservedly holds the title of the father of chemotherapy. The real revolution in the treatment of syphilis occurred only a few decades later, with the discovery of penicillin by Alexander Fleming. The world's first true antibiotic proved to be incredibly effective against Treponema pallidum, and, at the same time, practically harmless to humans. It still suppresses it quite successfully to this day, but even after the appearance of a simple, cheap, and effective cure, it was not possible to completely defeat the disease. And all because, in the early stages, most sufferers simply refused to go to a doctor due to a centuries-old, deeply ingrained shame. But the darkest, most shameful chapter in the history of syphilis was not written in medieval brothels or in alchemical laboratories, but in the southern United States in the 20th century, and it was written by the hand of the government. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began an experiment that would go down in history as one of the most monstrous violations of medical ethics. It is known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The official goal was to study the natural course of untreated syphilis in black men. For this, 600 poor African-American sharecroppers were recruited from Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest regions in the country. Of them, 399 had syphilis, and 201 were healthy and made up the control group. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term for a whole range of ailments, from anemia to fatigue. They were promised free medical care, free transportation to the clinic, hot meals on examination days, and, most cynically, a $50 payment for their funerals. In reality, they were not treated. They were simply observed, like lab rats. With cold, scientific scrupulousness, doctors documented how the disease slowly and agonizingly destroyed their bodies. The men were given placebos, useless pills and ointments. To track neurological damage, they were regularly given painful spinal taps, which were called special free treatment. The men, illiterate and trusting, lined up for this torture, sincerely believing it would help them. They knew nothing. They trusted the doctors in white coats, and especially a nurse named Eunice Rivers, an African-American woman who became a key liaison between the researchers and the subjects, gaining their complete trust and convincing them year after year to remain in the program. Then, in the mid-1940s, a medical miracle occurred. Penicillin became widely available as a simple, cheap, and incredibly effective cure for syphilis. Across the world, the disease that had terrorized humanity for centuries was finally conquered. A single shot could stop the horror. But for the men in Tuskegee, nothing changed. The experiment continued. The scientists running the study actively prevented the subjects from receiving treatment elsewhere. During World War II, they arranged for the men in the study not to be drafted into the Army, where they would have been mandatorily given a blood test and immediately prescribed penicillin. Their names were put on special lists. Decade after decade, the inhuman study continued. The men went blind. Their hearts failed. swelling to incredible sizes from syphilitic aortitis. They went mad from neurosyphilis, turning into aggressive or apathetic lunatics. They died long, agonizing deaths, while the cure that could have saved them sat on the shelf in every pharmacy in the country. Unknowingly, they infected their wives, who in turn passed congenital syphilis to their children, condemning them to blindness, deafness, and deformities. And the doctors watched. They took notes. They published scientific papers in prestigious medical journals. The experiment, originally intended to last 6 months, went on for 40 years. It all ended in 1972, when an insider, a former Public Health Service employee named Peter Buxton, unable to remain silent any longer, told this horrifying story to Associated Press journalist Jean Heller. On July 25, 1972, the story exploded on the front pages of newspapers, causing a national scandal. The public outcry was enormous. The experiment was immediately terminated. By that time, only 74 of the 399 originally infected men were still alive. 28 had died directly from syphilis, 100 from related complications, 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. In 1997, President Bill Clinton offered a formal apology on behalf of the nation to the 8 surviving participants of the experiment. But the legacy of Tuskegee proved as persistent as the disease itself. A deep-seated, justified distrust of the medical system and the government within the African American community, which is felt to this day. It seemed that after the advent of penicillin and the exposure of the Tuskegee horror, syphilis would finally be relegated to history, a grim page in medical textbooks. Massive public awareness campaigns were conducted in developed countries. The Soviet Union even had a system of mandatory health screenings and compulsory treatment. Year after year, the number of cases steadily declined, approaching zero. And then, what happened, happened. The mid-90s, the collapse of old social systems, economic chaos, poverty, and an explosive rise in drug addiction and prostitution. Syphilis, a ghost of the past, re-entered the list of the most common venereal diseases. Today, in the 21st century, we are witnessing a new, alarming surge in cases worldwide. In the era of dating apps where casual sexual encounters have become the norm, the pale treponema has found a new, vast hunting ground for itself. A sense of false invulnerability, the thought that it can all be cured with a single shot, and the age-old irrational shame that prevents people from seeking medical help in time and warning their partners, create the perfect conditions for the triumphant return of the ancient ghost. It still makes men and women turn pale before the door of a venereologist's office, and the danger of turning pale forever, dissolving into madness, still remains. So, it is better not to avoid that visit, because in most cases when detected in the early stages, the prognosis is favorable. But the pale ghost is patient. It waits for us to forget the lessons of history. It waits for us to decide that we are safe, and then it will strike again.